the summer of 1968, the most feared man in New York City walked into a diner at 2 a.m. for a plate of chicken and grits. 5 Italian crime families had spent 30 years trying to figure out how to kill him. But on this humid July night, they wouldn't get the chance. And what happened the moment his coffee hit the table didn't just end a life. It shattered the underworld and unleashed absolute chaos on the streets of Harlem. In 1968, America was burning. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated in April. Robert Kennedy was killed in June. Cities were erupting in protest, and the social fabric of the country was being torn apart. But in Harlem, there was still one constant. One man who functioned as judge, jury, and executioner for the entire neighborhood. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson. For decades, Bumpy had held off the most vicious heavyweights of the Italian mafia, men like Dutch Schultz and Lucky Luciano. He fought them to a standstill until they had no choice but to do business with him. But by 1968, the atmosphere had changed. Bumpy was 62 years old. He had spent nearly half his life in maximum security prisons like Alcatraz. To the young, hungry wolves in the Genovese crime family, the old lion looked tired. They thought the king of Harlem was losing his grip. They thought the federal indictment hanging over his head had made him soft. But they had a problem they wouldn't understand until it was too late. Because Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. He was the only thing holding back a tidal wave of violence that was about to drown the city. And the question in the back rooms of Italian social clubs was simple. Was Bumpy finished? To the outside observer, it certainly looked that way. In 1968, Johnson was under a massive federal indictment for conspiracy to distribute narcotics. If convicted, he was looking at life in prison. For a man in his 60s with heart trouble, that was a death sentence. The Italian families, particularly the Genovese leadership, smelled blood in the water. They operated on a strict hierarchy where power was taken, not given. They looked at Bumpy and saw a man distracted by lawyers, court dates, and the inevitable decline of age. They saw the old guard. At the time, the Italians controlled the import, the wholesale heroin pipeline. Harlem was the retail. For years, Bumpy Johnson was the toll booth. If you wanted to sell in Harlem, you went through Bumpy. But with the indictment looming, the mob grew greedy. They started wondering if they could bypass the toll booth entirely. Why pay a percentage to an old man who might be in a cage by Christmas? Shipments were delayed. Prices were hiked without negotiation. It was a subtle pressure campaign designed to see if Bumpy would snap or fold. They assumed that a man fighting the U.S. government wouldn't have the energy for a street war. They looked at the paperwork. They looked at the statistics. But they failed to look at the streets. Because while the mob saw weakness, Harlem saw a legend. To the people of Harlem, Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a drug lord. He was a necessary evil, and often a savior. Power doesn't come from a gun. It comes from the people. In 1968, while under indictment, Bumpy wasn't hiding. Sooner he was on the avenue. He paid rent for grandmothers facing eviction. He funded education for neighborhood kids. He delivered turkeys during the holidays. He cultivated a persona that was part CEO, part violent enforcer, and part Robin Hood. There's a story from that final year. A young stick-up crew robbed a local merchant under Bumpy's protection. Within hours, they weren't arrested by the police. They were found by Bumpy's men. They weren't killed, but they were educated in a way that guaranteed they would never make that mistake again. This was the weakness the Italians misread. They mistook benevolence for softness. Bumpy walked the streets without bodyguards because he didn't need them. The neighborhood was his security detail. Doormen, bartenders, shoeshine boys, grandmothers at second-story windows, everyone watched. And if a stranger drove into Harlem with bad intentions, Bumpy knew before they crossed 110th Street. While the feds built their case and the mob plotted a takeover, Bumpy still held court. Disputes weren't settled in courtrooms, they were settled by him. But time is the one enemy you can't bribe. And despite his grip on the streets, Bumpy's heart was ticking like a time bomb. July 7th, 1968. At 2 a.m., Bumpy Johnson walked into Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue. It was famous. a late-night gathering spot for the elite of Black America. Jazz musicians, politicians, power brokers. For Bumpy, it was routine. It was a sanctuary. He sat in his usual booth. The waitress knew the order: chicken, hominy grits, coffee. Some accounts say his protege Frank Lucas was there, though historians debate how close Lucas truly was in those final days. What is certain is this: Bumpy was in good spirits. He joked about the indictment. He laughed about how the feds could indict a ham sandwich if they wanted to. Then, silence. He clutched his chest. There was no gunshot, no screeching tires, no masked assassins bursting through the door. Just a 62-year-old man's heart finally giving out. Panic erupted. An ambulance was called. He was rushed to Harlem Hospital. At 2:55 a.m., Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was pronounced dead. The king was gone. The news hit the streets before sunrise, and the reaction wasn't relief. It was fear. The mob realized its mistake almost instantly. Bumpy hadn't been the problem. He had been the dam, the regulator, the stabilizer in a brutal economy. With Bumpy dead, the dam broke, and Harlem's underworld fractured overnight. There was no clear successor. No one with the authority to sit across from the Genovese family and demand respect. A scramble for power began. A new generation emerged, more ruthless, less disciplined. Men like Frank Lucas would later cut out the Italian middlemen entirely and source heroin directly from Southeast Asia, creating the infamous blue magic. The code Bumpy enforced, civilians off limits, order above chaos, died with him at that table. High-purity heroin flooded the streets. An epidemic followed that would devastate Harlem for decades. The Italians tried to assert direct control, but the new generation was uncontrollable. Flashy, violent, uninterested in the old rules of the commission. The irony is brutal. The mob wanted him gone because they thought he was bad for business. But his death unleashed a storm that brought unprecedented law enforcement pressure and ultimately weakened the mob's own grip on New York. Bumpy Johnson died a free man. The federal indictment was dismissed upon his death. The Italians never got to take him out. The prisons never got to lock him away for life. He went out on his own terms, eating the food he loved in the neighborhood he ruled. But the legacy he left wasn't just power. It was a warning. When you remove the devil you know, you better be ready for the demons you don't. And the man who stepped into that vacuum would build an empire that changed the heroin trade forever.